to bring you in. Access and equity, mentioned by our earlier speakers this morning, an important issue globally. And you, as head of the World Access to Higher Education Network, we look forward very much to what you have to say.
Thank you, David. You can hear me well there, and thank you for the introduction. And as you say, always some little wrinkles, aren't there, with this form of conference. But I would like to really thank you, David, and thank you, colleagues, for inviting me today to this very important event. And it gives a great pleasure to be able to speak to you all. I'm a little sorry that I couldn't actually be in London in person, but I'm actually going on a family vacation later on today. So unfortunately, or fortunately for me, I guess, we have to go to the airport. So I have to do this rather remotely. But thank you very much, David, for inviting me today. I'm just going to try and get my slides up. There we are. So my name is Graeme Atherton. As you say, I'm head of the World Access to Education Network, but also, as you'll see in a moment, I also work on access and equity in higher education in the UK, where I'm based in London at the University of West London, where I've founded and leading a network called the National Education Opportunities Network, on NEON. But I'm glad that equity and access in higher education has been already covered in the conference today, as is emerging as a key issue on the global higher education stage. As I'll speak about later on, last week's UNESCO Higher Education Conference, their first in 10 years, there were numerous sessions on equity and access in higher education. And clearly, we see delegates across the world thinking very closely about how they can support access and success in their higher education institutions and their countries for learners from all backgrounds. So let's begin by just talking about what we mean here by equitable access and success. Access to higher education, we think of as access to students from all backgrounds, those from all different socio-economic backgrounds, or of course, male and female students, students with and without disabilities, students from rural and urban areas. However, when we talk about equitable access, we're really concerned with participation in higher education for students from minority backgrounds, particular countries, for disadvantaged majority backgrounds. We're careful in how we speak about this, of course, because we know this means different things in different countries. In the UK, socio-economic background is a very strong focus of the work that we do. In other countries, of course, ethnic background and rural and urban issues are crucial when it comes to understanding who does and does not participate in higher education. I'm sure in your own individual countries, you'll have particular issues with regard to who does and does not participate. But of course, access is only relevant if it comes with success. We also know that in many countries, the issue is, of course, about who participates, that low participation rates are visible for students, say, from rural backgrounds or possibly from low socioeconomic backgrounds. We also know that issues of permanence and completion. Too many students in some contexts don't complete their studies. When they complete their studies, do not enter into the kind of employment outcomes you'd like to see. So access is important, but it has to come with success. We have to see learners progressing through and achieving their individual potential. That's what I mean by equitable access and success, to orientate our discussion today. However, a little background about the work I'm engaged in. 10 years ago, I helped found an organisation in the UK called NEON, the National Education Opportunities Network. We're an organisation in the UK who support universities in their work in equitable access and success. We have 150 members, 120 universities in the UK, and we support them by providing training, opportunities for communities of practice for debate and exchange of collaboration, as well as having an annual conference, providing research and advocacy, providing the kind of things membership organisations do. It is an important issue in the UK, access to higher education. It's a government priority, and it's also something that all universities have to engage with as part of what's called access and participation plans. So they have to submit to the higher education regulator. But NEON operates in that space where we try and encourage universities and others to collaborate and work together and improve the work they're doing with learners. Particularly, many of our members as universities work with schools. work with students prior to higher education, targeting those students from low-income backgrounds, providing them with additional information, advice and guidance regarding higher education. Many students who come from backgrounds and communities where their parents and others have not progressed to higher education aren't as aware or understand the routes into higher education, the application processes, student choice and subject choice. Also, of course, our members also work with schools and with learners supporting their attainment, offering mentoring, offering additional courses, additional classes, try and engage them and ensure that those from lower socioeconomic groups, students with disabilities, those particular community and regional backgrounds will achieve the level of attainment, the level of grades necessary to enter higher education. But as well as NEON, we also just recently launched the World Access to Education Network. For the past 5 years, we in NEON have been convening something called World Access to Education Day, or WAHED. This has been one day where we have focused as an international day of commemoration and focus on inequalities in access and higher education and success across the world. Underneath the banner of WAHED, over 200 organisations in the past 5 years have organised events in their own universities and organisations in over 70 different countries. In the last 2 years, we've had a large online conference at WAHED with over 1,000 registrations and inputs from our partners who we work with in WAHED, including the World Bank, UNESCO, and also a number of foundations, like the Asia Europe Foundation and the Lumina Foundation in the USA. So we work with a range of partners. WAHED will be a new organisation, which I'll speak about a little bit more later on, which will help convene and collaborate and bring together those across the world who are concerned with addressing inequalities in access and success in higher education. But that's enough for the background of work I'm involved with. So let's now think about the issue. What are the issues here when it comes to access and equity in higher education, and what's been done to address them? 5 years ago, I produced a report with colleagues called Charting Equity in Higher Education, Drawing the Global Access Map. This was an attempt to scope the data available across the whole world in terms of who participates in higher education by social background. And try and scope out where the gaps existed and which countries were covered. What we see here in this piece of work, we also looked at data here from the World Bank, OECD, UNESCO, and bringing this data together in one report. Our next slide was our access map. What we found was in all of the countries where we could find data across the world, and that was 90% of countries, around 10% we couldn't find data, there was some form of inequality in HE participation by social background, be that either social economic background or gender, or indeed in some countries we found other data, often related to urbanity and rurality. What we found, therefore, is that across the world, this goes across different kinds of systems. So we're talking internationally, we're not just talking about those systems that are in a phase of development, but those systems which have been in existence for quite a long period of time. A common characteristic is inequality in participation by social background. However, as we'll see later on, while the map we felt was an important contribution to this debate, one of the big issues is the quality and availability of data in this area. Because the range of data available, how frequently it's produced, how up to date that data is, how accurate that data is, whether it's produced and released by governments and others, varies greatly across the world. So we have a map here. It's very much an ongoing process, trying to understand better in some regions of the world, actually who goes to higher education in terms of their social background. It's not an easy process, and it's an evolving picture. And that's not surprising because collecting data is an extensive investment. And in many countries where resources are finite, we have to choose between investing in data or investing in developing new courses, etc. So we can see why that might be a challenge. The final slide here from this report shows just a snapshot of the kind of characteristics of social background we're talking about. We did a survey of 50 different countries as part of this report. As well as looking at the secondary data for all the world, looked at a survey of 50 countries. What we looked at, these are the kind of data collected on forms of social background. So obviously gender is the area of the best data. Then socioeconomic background, 36 countries, 33 countries collected data on rural background, and right down to 29 by ethnicity, and then down to a little less by language and indigenous grouping. What this shows you is when we're talking about access and equity, we're talking about different kinds of groups. It's a complex picture. With this intersection here, obviously nobody has one particular identity. We're all male, female. We all have some kind of socioeconomic background. We have some kind of ethnic background. There's intersections there in terms of what we mean. It's a complex picture, and it varies across the world. We see in some countries we focus much more, say, on gender than we do on age or we do on morality. Okay, now specifically looking a little bit at the more recent research. This report was produced very recently by UNESCO in combination with the Times Higher Ranking. This looks at particularly gender inequality and how global universities are performing. In this second report, we see this slide is very interesting. What it shows is over a period of the last 40 or 50 years ago, a rising number of students entering higher education who are female. You can see here this upward trajectory in the numbers of students across all regions of the world. So we see here a rising trajectory in numbers of female students. So we see increasingly a question of this. It's again a separate presentation altogether about the issues between who participates, who's male and female in higher education. But you ought to see there across the world at this rising level of participation for female students. The second graph here from the same report shows average percentage of first generation students across the world. Gives us another take on this earlier issue of how we better understand who goes to education across the world. And we see it's important to look at various reports here because there is no one authoritative source of data on who participates in higher education by social background. UNESCO collects information from individual countries by gender. There is some good information there. Once it goes beyond gender, it becomes more difficult. And what the issue here of this report is it actually looks at different universities. What we see here again is that across regions, there isn't, in terms of percentage of first generation students by region, there isn't these huge differences. North America is a little lower, but we see also, again, that the differences in terms of numbers of first generation students from these universities as part of Times Higher study isn't incredibly contrasting across regions. America a little low, but not huge differences really across different regions of the world. Now, this is only 732 universities. I say only, because we know there are many, many more universities across the world. But it adds to our growing understanding of really what is the global picture here with who goes to higher education by social background. The next report we're looking at now is, the issue of who participates. We know something about that, as we've seen from our first two reports. We know there's inequality, but understanding that is an ongoing issue. But what's being done about it? What are policymakers and others doing to actually address these inequalities? This piece of work I was involved with last year with the Asia-Europe Educational Foundation. They sponsored this piece of work, working with ministers across the Asia-Europe region to understand national equity policies. What are the key findings? Encouragingly, across the 47 countries where we got responses from ministerial departments in 47 countries across these two regions, equity features in virtually all of the policy documents for higher education. However, less than a third of those countries have specific higher education equity strategy. So while it features in documents, finding a specific strategy harder to do. Lower income and socioeconomic background was the most common equity target group of students with disabilities. And only a third of countries actually have specific targets in this area. So we do see at that high level, governments understanding equity as an issue and variability in terms of how that flows through in terms of detail and commitment in policy documents. Recommendations from that report were thinking about production of specific strategies by governments in this area. Again, that issue of monitoring, evaluation and data collection to understand better across these countries and others who is progressing and why. And thinking about, again, that issue on number 5 there of collaboration. Finding a forum where people can think together, discuss these issues, and learn from each other. Crucial. Increasing education overall. And finally, progress in the development of effective strategies should be something that's continually monitored. So we're very hopeful with colleagues in ACE that this report will be a regular feature of ministerial discussions biannually across this region. Okay, so we thought a little bit about what governments are doing. What about universities and others? What are they doing? What's working across the world in terms of making a difference to these inequalities we've discussed so far today? This piece of work was produced by the World Bank, and now it appeared in this journal here, but it was a World Bank produced piece of work. What they tried to do was do a systematic review of the literature, looking at the impact of outreach and financial aid. So outreach is activities universities undertake with school-aged learners to support and enable them to enter higher education. And financial aid is, of course, bursaries, grants, scholarship, waiving of fees, etc., to allow students from low-income backgrounds to progress to higher education. Again, they found that the kind of detailed experimental work where we see rigorous studies that compare the impact of this policy work against those who don't participate, so kind of controlled trial related experimental research where you will say take a group of learners who participate in outreach activity and then a group who haven't and compare their outcomes, as you do in the medical field, of course. That work is very rare and mainly found in North America. So again, the issue of evidence evaluation data is a challenge. However, what they'll see in the second graph is they found information and support provided together. So not just information, not just telling students that this is how you apply to higher education, this is where you find information about courses, or telling their parents, providing support as well. So additional academic support, extra tuition classes done after school, maybe delivered by either higher education academics or delivered by students, or mentoring programs, or summer school programs where learners will come to a university in the in-between term period, spend some time staying there, working with academic staff, developing their attainment, developing understanding of their subject area, was much more impactful. So it does prove, I mean, what's encouraging about this work, it does seem to indicate that when this work is done together over a sustained basis, and we provide evaluation of it, it can make an impact on who goes to higher education. So we do know a little bit about the kind of things that can have an impact. We talked before about policies with strategies and targets, which do appear to be having some kind of impact. And we know the sort of things universities can do. So we do know, we have an idea, but we need better evidence here. Okay, so about collaborations, so back to WAHIN. Again, WAHIN was launched last week. It's the first dedicated global network looking specifically at equitable access and success. Again, the purpose of WAHIN is trying to bring together those concerned about these issues, those who are committed to reducing inequalities within their own countries or institutions, to try and improve their practice, develop this key evidence base, and then integrate this into strategies, practice, and policies. It builds, as I say, early on WAHED, which has engaged over 1,000 organisations over the past 5 years. But again, if you're interested as well in the issue of what governments do, that earlier piece of work we talked about ACEF, we've combined it with some other work we've done to produce what's called a global equity map. At the end of this presentation, there's some references there. You can go to our website, and for free, you can look at this global equity map and have a look at what countries are doing and what their policy commitments appear to be in this area, if that, of course, is your area of interest. Our aim is to find a world where more people from minorities, disadvantaged majority populations can benefit from participation in higher education through capacity building, collaboration, convening, and campaigning. Why? We'll undertake capacity building courses. We have 2 courses on retention and success coming up later this year. We'll have action forums of global communities of practice, bringing together those across in the key areas in this field, including pre-HE engagement we discussed today on mission practice, research and advocacy, but also international education. Again, an increasingly interested in the international education field is who participates in international mobility and exchange. Post-pandemic, will we see hybrid forms of international mobility, where we see learners in virtual exchanges, opening up opportunities to learners possibly who couldn't afford to take on the financial costs, etc., of actual physical exchange? Will this wide participation and access? And again, that's an area that we want to collaborate and rebuild together to discuss. We'll, of course, continue to have our World Access to Education Day, and we'll be launching a new qualification, professionalising this field. For those keen to develop their skills and expertise related to equity, we'll be having a new global MBA launch next year. So finally, let's turn our attention to what we know about the MENA region. I haven't spoke too much about the Middle East area. I thought it would be appropriate today to set the broader global context. Then in discussion, consider what the implications may be for the Middle East area. What we do know, of course, as we'll see in the next slide, is participation rates in higher education overall across the Middle East region are relatively strong compared to other parts of the world. We also know, it isn't a slide on this, but we also know that actual investment in tertiary education is actually proportionately very strong in the Middle East area. So we know there is some evidence there of commitment to higher education overall, and understanding and awareness of inequalities. We do see, though, that World Bank's strategy on human capital in the Middle East and North Africa region suggests there is some issues on terms of improving the human capital stock, improving learning and education for all. And I think that's something that we would all share as a goal. But again, I think, as we'll see in a moment, I think clearly there is that potential in the area for exchange of knowledge and practice. I would suggest that clearly this deep commitment to higher education as a driver of economic and social change across the region provides an excellent foundation for real focus on equitable access and success work. To develop that understanding of what policymakers are doing at the moment and how they could work together to have those more nuanced and focused policies. To think about, as we discussed before, how to collect better data and have better evidence regarding not just who is participating, but what activities are being undertaken, what is working. But also doing that in such a way as reflects the unique characteristics of institutions and countries in the region. And that's really important. Because as I said earlier on, when we looked at the earlier slides, what we mean by equitable access and success varies across contexts. There are a range of groups in different countries who are underrepresented or who find it hard to access higher education. But a combination of those groups and the context of those groups differs in different countries. So we can have over broader messages, but it's really important we develop those national approaches as well. And actually not just national, but regional and local approaches. Because often we've found that the real differences can be made when we work closely with schools, colleges, and community groups and others in local areas to really give those the opportunity to progress to higher education the ability to do so. As we see here, school enrollment, rather confusing title there from the World Bank in this piece of work. They actually mean tertiary enrollment levels. What it shows you is there's been a distinct increase in tertiary enrollment levels across the last 30 years or so, positioning the region very favourably when it comes to tertiary participation levels with many other regions across the world. So it's clear that there's an appetite, strong appetite for higher education across the region. Many of those participating, I'm sure, will be from disadvantaged majority or minority backgrounds. But it's really important we understand better, if that's the case, where those points will make a real difference. So what are the key messages then coming out of this overview of access and equity across the world, with some reference again to particular context in the Middle East? Firstly, data collection. How can capability and capacity be advanced? How can institutions and governments better collect data and information, understand who is participating, why they're not participating, and use that data as a lever for change? Often we will see differences, for instance, across subject areas in institutions. What does that mean for the access and equity question? We haven't discussed so much that today in today's presentation, but we know in some subject disciplines there is a strong representation, say, of female and male students. We know some excellent progress is being made in some areas. For instance, in STEM fields, we know that in the Middle East region, North Africa region, actually female participation is actually very high, relatively to other parts of the world. But there are other concerns regarding other subject areas there will be in all parts of the world. Understanding of policy approaches. We know, as I said from earlier on, for the equity map, from research that we've undertaken, something about what countries are committing to or outlining as overall broad policy approaches where equity and access in higher education are concerned. We know less about which policies are working. We know less about policy implementation. So there are gaps in our knowledge here. Understanding the work of universities. We do know some of the successful approaches from the World Bank research universities couldn't undertake. We know less about who's undertaking them, how, why, and where. Although that knowledge base is increasing, we are rapidly, I think, through our work in WAHEN, understanding more about what universities are doing in this area. Particularly, we're seeing in some universities strong leadership commitment. We might know less, I guess, about the particular specifics as we would like to know, but we do know about what makes change in universities. We do know that if we're going to drive through change in university context, strong leadership is important. Collaboration with staff and academic staff is important, as well as, of course, having evidence. It's an evidence-based field we're working in. The importance of collaboration and capacity building, where there is good practice being undertaken across the world. It's crucial that it's shared and discussions are undertaken with others to make sure that where we find activities are being successful, others can learn and think about what that means and then think to collaborate internationally. We're very used to collaborating internationally in higher education, in areas of research, international higher education, and also in understanding better teaching. We need also to be international in our thoughts when it comes to equitable access and success in higher education. And finally, linking this issue to broader concerns regarding the future development of higher education globally, particularly with regard to sustainable development. UNESCO's Sustainable Development Goals include one, is access to tertiary education for all. But it's crucial that we see this question of equity and access in that broader frame of sustainability. What is the future for higher education? What sort of student bodies do we want to see in populations? The population we want to see in 2030 and beyond? How do we ensure global inequality globally is a huge issue? How do we ensure that universities are contributing to addressing inequality? The first step being thinking about who enters those institutions and succeeds. So it's part of a broader set of questions. It's really important, I think, going forward, we position access and equity as part of those broader set of questions for universities. Finally, those are my contact details. If any of you wish to contact me directly about joining WAHEN, where the website is there, you'll also find on the WAHEN website a global equity policy map. Where you will find descriptions of policies with regard to higher education, equitable access and success in over 100 countries. But do contact me if you want to learn more about what's in this presentation or have discussions or share practice and share knowledge. And in the final slide, you will see the references related to the reports which I've quoted in these slides today. And I'm sure that David and colleagues will disseminate these slides amongst you all. And please do use them as a resource taking your work forward. David, thank you very much.
Graeme, thank you very much indeed. And Graeme's presentation, along with all of the others, will go up on the website for this event. So you will be able to look at it again, share it with your friends, and so on. Graeme, I just want to say one thing to you while people are thinking here about questions that they may have. I think what we've seen with WAHED and now WAHEN is a journey. We hear a lot of things about policy and aspiration, and a lot of that came from the UNESCO conference in Barcelona last week. But I think what we've seen with the work that you have done is that it started with a World Access to Higher Education Day. In other words, something specific, something that was achievable, and something which has grown over the years. You've moved now to become a network, and I know you're discussing a number of ways in which that network will develop. But the reason I want to share that story is not just to pay tribute to you and your leadership of all of this, but just share with colleagues in the room here, some of whom are rectors and ministers, that yes, it is a big problem, it is a big challenge, but taking the first step on the journey and then following through is a very good way to proceed. So I think, you know, with what you've done, you've given us a model about how this can be taken forward, and we thank you very much indeed for that.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Can I invite colleagues in the room and colleagues online now to either make observations or to put any questions to you? We have one question in the front right-hand table. Can you start by saying who you are and where you're from, please?
Yeah, good morning or good afternoon. I am Reem Al-Bainain from Bahrain Polytechnic, Deputy CEO for Academic Affairs. Thank you for this informative presentation. I would like to about access. I think all the universities now are looking to increase the access and to engage more categories such as adult and mature. And do you think this will change the university if it has come to mature and adult learners? This means we need to focus more on micro-credential instead of the classic way of a qualification. To what extent we need to do a major changes to our structure and higher education institute to be more responsive and to the demand and the market? Do we need to do radical changes to our structure to accommodate or provide more opportunities to different categories and to increase the access to the higher education? Thank you very much.
Excellent question, Graeme.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That was an excellent question. And I think the implication there is something I would agree with. I think if we are going to offer opportunities to different groups of learners, particularly as you specify older or mature learners, there's going to have to be change in what institutions do. There'll be structural changes. This may be in terms of qualifications, in teaching styles, institutional culture as well. I think often when we see different sorts of learners, different sorts of backgrounds entering higher education, we need to consider how we ensure that those students are able to achieve. So are there support mechanisms in place? Are academic and faculty staff attuned? Now, there's maybe different attitudes and approaches to learning when they enter. I mean, fundamentally, of course, if students enter with that desire to achieve, desire to progress, and desire to learn, I think that's important to keep in mind, that we sometimes do feel that these structural changes look fairly daunting to us. But of course, if one thinks on the teaching level, we're still there trying to offer those even kind of different packaging, maybe micro-credentials, you point out, but it's still trying to convey that key knowledge issues in our subject areas. However, I would agree with you that we won't be able to see the kind of progression and change unless we change the institutions. That process will take over time. I think that, again, depending on policies implemented, where we've seen increases, say, in older, mature learners, it doesn't happen immediately. It happens over time. So universities have time to adjust. But I do think that when we think about older learners, we've seen this probably in the UK as well. We have to think of the offer we make. Possibly it means offering our course in more flexible ways. Possibly a hybrid and online learning may be a possibility, maybe desired by certain learner groups. But also that understanding that if we're talking about older and mature learners, they have other challenges in their lives, perhaps, that, as we all know at our ages, that young learners do not have. So yes, the adaptation is important, but in doing that, it's crucial that staff are supported in that as well. The vast majority of staff are welcoming of new learners entering, of new people having experiences with higher education, but need to be equipped to deal with those learners. So capacity building is really important when we look for institutional change as well.
You weren't with us earlier on, Graeme, but one of the pictures which Michael Murphy was painting was of really quite radical change within the universities without walls, and the changing role for members of staff, which builds, I think, on what you are saying. We have another question.
I'm Marcia Mar, multimedia artist, peace ambassador. I want to ask you the context of this internationalization of access to knowledge is a revolution in itself. So the university's role now is an identity is transformed because we have open source research. We need to find solutions for the planet and also the excitement of collaboration to take to the next level. I was just wondering, in terms of disruption, innovation, and transformation, and the identity of who we are as institutions of transmission of knowledge, but also rethinking humanity itself, or aims, or science, or collaborations, women representation. For equality, I think we can have 50% of women in power and their voices being multicultural voices share all over the world. But if we are to have equity, we'll have to have women leading for about 100,000 years at least. And people from ethnic minorities, disabilities, different abilities, and so forth. So this is the point of revolution. When we're looking at the transmission of knowledge is already accessible in a global scale for anyone who can have access to a phone. So where are we taking this innovation, transformation, collaboration, open source research to the next level in the structures that we construct internationally? Because everyone is similarly unique, and then every place has their own identity and the capacity to bring something new. So how can we foster that dialogue? Thank you.
Well, I think this is how we foster that dialogue. I think that there are a number of dialogues you're describing there. I mean, you're describing a number of different issues. I mean, open resource research and access to research is very important, but that in itself is a slightly separate issue from who participates in higher education. You can make and have open access to information, access to knowledge, but this won't necessarily shift who accesses that knowledge. There are groups in society for whom higher education and university is a long way from their thinking, a long way from where they sit. Internationalization, for me, looks at international exchange of practice and knowledge, in particular focused areas of academia. We are quite comfortable in academia to an extent with opening up the research we're doing and collaborating on research projects and collaborating on research papers. We see that as an important marker of success. What I believe we need to consider is having these tougher discussions about why certain groups don't participate in higher education, what it takes to change, as our first questioner posed to us, or perhaps the University about Wars concept that Michael spoke about earlier on. This kind of internationalization should allow us to have tough and difficult questions we need to ask ourselves within higher education, but also foster that broader engagement. Because in that sort of discussion situation, it's engaging with those outside of higher education, which is crucial. Policymakers, NGOs, the private sector, we are part of society in higher education. I think possibly access and success and the equity in those areas really highlights our position within wider society. So that internationalization process must also be led from somewhere. It must be organized and coherent, because you've got to have progress. So you can have discussions, which is very good, but what will they lead to concrete outcomes for students and learners? So there needs to be a structure and organization behind that internationalization drive.
Are there any other questions? One very back of the room.
I just want to pop on. If you're asking a question, try to look at the camera. David, can you tell them where the camera is?
This is slightly counterintuitive. When you're standing up asking a question, you're looking at the screen, which is the obvious thing to do. but the camera which is sending our pictures to the rest of the world is.
That looks great.
So although it feels as if you're talking to the backs of people here, could you ask your questions looking at the camera, please?
Thank you. The name is Mohammed Amir, former Director of International Affairs with the Jeddah Chamber of Commerce. Let me emphasize that I'm not in any way representing the Chamber of Commerce. You mentioned, sir, that in your closing remarks, there were two questions you mentioned. What kind of students we want to see in these universities? And take in consideration that most of the students that come from the MENA regions into Europe and also going to North America. The political arena plays a very important role in these students going out. Do you think that the number is fairly distributed among the MENA region? And do you think that everybody who comes out, or the number of people who are coming out, the number of students who are coming out, do you think that there is a fair choice in the students who are coming out? You also mentioned that policies has to be made. But until now, okay, most of the students that are coming out, majority of the students coming out from the MENA region are coming out based on government policies. So who make these choices? And what role does the university has in deciding who comes out? Thank you.
Yeah, I guess in terms of who comes out, I mean, and where international students go to, that's an important question, but I'm kind of more concerned about who those international students are. I'm kind of more concerned about what socioeconomic background they come from. Are in the MENA region, are universities prioritising opportunities for internationalisation and exchange and mobility or movement out of the region for those from some lower socioeconomic groups, etc. As to which parts of the world students in the MENA region may enter, then that will be dependent upon the collaborations and fostered between universities inside and outside the region. But what we do know is characteristically across the world, international higher education tends to be preserved of higher income groups. That to me is the issue that is of most concern. For policymakers and universities, where the role of universities in this? Well, of course, the relationship between government and university differs across different nations. In some countries, universities have more autonomy than other parts of the world. However, nevertheless, they remain in all countries an important part of the broader civil structure in that country. And those who lead and take universities forward have a responsibility, if they wish to see greater inequality, in acting upon that in their policies. That to me is the defining feature. Internationalisation, international exchange of students is very important, but it is who has opportunity, which to me is the real tough questions we need to ask ourselves.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Graeme, I'd just like to ask you one.
Sure.
My memories of I think it may have been the first World Access to Higher Education Day. You managed the most amazing hookup of different countries around the world, each of which shared an example of successful practice. Now, I'm sure as you've gone on, you've collected many, many more of these. But just to close your session, are you able to share with colleagues here just one or two things that universities can do that have been proven in different parts of the world to have impact? I know you've mentioned a number in your presentation, but if you could just draw the attention of colleagues to one or two steps that they could take that will achieve some impact.
Well, firstly, I think, David, it's understanding the context of, say, your own institution or country. So, therefore, there needs to be efforts to collect information on the background of students when they enter the institution. are they urban or rural students? Are they from different ethnic backgrounds? Are they different socioeconomic backgrounds? Now, of course, some will respond that we can't collect this information. My response was, you don't want to collect that information. So, firstly, collect information and data. Secondly, I would argue have specific strategies in this area and have conversations. That strategy comes with a conversation in your own institution about inequality and what it means. Talk to your staff, talk to within the institution about what's their position on these issues. Yeah, I mean, if you're going to move an organisation forward, it has to be done collectively. So what does inequality in participation and access mean in your institutions? And then I would say develop collaborations and with schools and other organisations in your country that support those with different backgrounds to enter. And start with, if you're starting from a kind of a position where this is an issue that your organisation or regions addressed before, start with a modest, achievable concept of the way forward. What we see in examples across the world, David, is often these are smaller initiatives, but developing an understanding of the issue of equitable access and success. And I will finish, David, by saying the importance of this. I think, as your previous speakers will have outlined, this conference is an opportunity to consider the future of higher education in this region across the world, as UNESCO's event was last week. And I think this kind of issue of equity and who participates is no longer now, I think, one that is a nice thing, an additional luxury for universities to consider. Universities have to consider their role in broader society. It's widely acknowledged that inequality is an issue in early 21st century societies across the world. Universities have to consider carefully how they engage with that if they want to remain as relevant, as important, as we all know they have been in the 20th century and wish to be for the rest of the 21st.
Well, Graeme, thank you very much for that. Thank you for spending the first part of your family holiday with us.
Oh, thank you, David. Thank you for inviting me.
Let us all join now to say thank you to you.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Have a safe flight and a lovely holiday, and we wish you continuing success with the work that you are doing.
Thank you, David. I hope the rest of the conference proves as successful and rewarding as it has been so far. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much.